Constantly modifying kOS programs for each individual mission is starting to get me into trouble. Not only is it time wasting, but all these individual tweaks leave my scripts prone to errors. Through the use of parameters and a library of global functions, I can create code that's accessible to all of my vessels without having to be constantly modified. This new code is going to immediately be put to use collecting photographs from space over the continental United States. As well, I polish off my first batch of contracts in the X-Plane research program. Let's get started. Last episode, I finally finished off my first RP-1 program of this campaign, allowing me to pick up the X-Plane research program, making available a new batch of contracts. Now, most of these contracts require more capable jet engines than I currently have, but this breaking the sound barrier contract does not require a plane to be a jet, and I have a number of X-1 rocket planes that can easily pull this off. One of which happens to be getting mounted to a carrier as we speak, so I'll grab this one right away. You may also recall that I've been struggling with the 5,000 kilometers downrange contract, which would complete the suborbital rocket development program. I've got some good news on that front coming towards the end of this video, but at this time I just wanted to get something going in the VAB, so I grabbed Downrange Distance LV Development Difficult, a contract I've done before, but doing it again will earn me another batch of reputation and confidence. But before heading into the VAB, I wanted to speed along the research of supersonic flight by hiring 20 more researchers, bringing the total staff in that facility to 80. It was then into the VAB to get a V2 rocket going for the LV development contract. Specifically, I started with V2 No.4, which was the rocket that pulled this off the first time, but has since been used to take high altitude near space photographs of Earth. I've exhausted the science available over the water from this experiment, so my plan is to send it over land. But I first need to mount a service module holding 500 units of sounding payload, which is a requirement for the contract. I want the rocket to head northwest instead of east. I played a little bit with the inclination setting on McJeb's ascent guidance, but that's really about setting the desired inclination of a full orbit, which clearly does affect the heading, but I soon realized it would be easier to just use the same kOS script that accomplished this mission the first time. Notice we have a variable here called desired heading, which is 90 degrees, but what I can do is change that to a parameter. So what you just do is you put in the word parameter here. And now that launch script, V2 No.4 script, takes a parameter, and you don't want to lock it to anything. You want to keep that at 0. That way it forces it to put in a parameter. So now I can have any heading I want, and northwest is 315. So let's run V2 No.3, and we'll go 315. And I do like the fact that if I head off in that way, it doesn't roll the craft. That was my roll command. So now it should be heading off this way. There it goes, yeah. So I like that, and I want to get this. It's really about getting this to be over mainland, like the whole way. Hang on, why am I using this rocket? This is the No.3 V2. I have a No.4 V2 with the upgraded A9 engine that I've already paid for. That's the rocket that lifted up the Albert II last episode. And it would go further and higher and more science. Speaking of science, we're just about 40 kilometers. We're running now, and now we're running this over the forests. Yes, so this is high atmosphere over the forest. And I think we're going to end up being over mainland this entire way, which is great. And then once we crack 140, it'll be space over the forest. We'll do that. We'll satisfy the contract. We've got a stack of reputation. happy, scaring the bejeebers out of everybody living in northern Florida and southern Georgia. But yeah, I should switch this to the A9 version of this rocket. And I happen to have the booster saved as a subassembly. So all I have to do is get rid of this and then just replace it with the A9 booster. Beautiful. And you'll be seeing this mission performed later in this video, but I want to make a small diversion first. Going back over this older program made me realize what a mess it was. It took some time just to puzzle out what I was thinking. I was moving pieces around, making copying and pasting mistakes, and it made me realize I need to clean up my act if I want to continue with kOS in RP-1. Thankfully, I've been inspired by a new kOS series at the Brickamass YouTube channel. I'll put a link to his kOS Basics playlist in the description. It's an excellent series, especially for those just starting out, and has got me realizing that a little bit more organization now will make my life a lot easier in the future. See, a lot of these functions in this program get reused over and over with only minor tweaks, but it's those minor changes that get you. It would be a lot cleaner if I organized these into a library that all my programs will have access to. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a new folder, and I'm going to call this folder library, lib for library. And then I'm going to create a new file called launch functions, and then I'm going to move all of these functions into this new file because this is how I'm getting myself into trouble. I'm taking these functions and I'm modifying them, and I shouldn't do that. So we're going to take this countdown function, we're going to put it into this launch function like so, right? And that should be the way I should. Now, why is this? Yeah, I'm a bit confused as to why Visual Studio isn't coloring this code. I eventually realized it is because I saved the file without the KS extension. So Visual Studio doesn't know this is a KerbalScript program and thus doesn't know how to color it. Speaking of which, you can see I've gotten away from using Notepad++, and I'm actually using proper coding software. There are a lot of advantages to doing this. Besides just the coloring, there's built-in error detection and stuff like that. The Visual Studio software here is recommended by Brickamass. He provides instructions on how to use it in his kOS Basics series if you want to go check that out. But why don't I just skip ahead to the tail end of the final test of this software, and I'll take the time to go over all of this in a bit more detail. Programs now, V2 No.4. Oh, that's the boot file. I'm gonna try and get better at creating unique boot files for each mission, but if I go to the actual mission, that was my tail fins on my booster blowing up. But if I go to actually V2 No.4, you can actually see that the program has actually simplified a lot. But let's talk about, you notice there were some numbers I put at the front. So the first number was a desired heading. So instead of going 90 degrees like I was doing before, I wanted to head off into a different direction, in this case with a heading of 315 degrees. So I have a parameter for that, so that if I want to launch in different directions in the future, I can do that just by putting in the number, and it's in the boot file that I record the number that I want so that people will, that I will remember the next time the vessel launches. And then there's a second parameter, which is that half pitched altitude, which is how I control how steeply it ascends. So in the original boot file, that was 315 and 30,000, so a heading of 315, and at 30,000 meters, I want you to be at a pitch of 45 degrees. That's what that all says. And the way you create a parameter in a program is simply with the keyword parameter. You usually put it up towards the top, and that tells kOS that when I go to run V2 No.4, it should expect two numbers, which it's going to store, at least two pieces of information, doesn't have to be numbers, in parameters. Now, if we go down to the actual program, this is the entire program. You might be wondering, wait a minute, didn't you have a whole stack of functions and all that kind of stuff? Yeah, I did. But what I did instead was take all of those and save them into a completely separate folder that I called, or a file called launchfunctions.ks. And in launchfunctions.ks is all those functions you've seen before. I didn't really change anything, but they're all in one place, and that will hopefully encourage me that if I have a future launch that's going to make use of that, instead of going in and mucking with these and changing them, which is how I got into trouble in the first place, instead I'm just going to change it here in the program that is designed for that specific mission. And so you can see here there's the countdown that calls the launch function for countdown. Then I have pitch maneuver. Pitch maneuver does require some information, the desired heading and the half pitch altitude. So if I take a look at pitch maneuver, which is right here, there's pitch maneuver. Notice that it has parameters to take in those numbers. The is 90 is what provides a default. So the default for the desired heading is 90, unless I provide a number. In this case, I provided 315, and that overwrites the 90. Same with half-pitched alt. To make this function available outside of this file, I have to declare the function as global. Okay, that's how tells kOS you can look for it. Now, that in itself isn't enough. Up here, I need to tell kOS where to find this library of functions. So I created a folder called library, in which there's only one file so far, but probably in the future I'll put other files. These are all files or functions associated with launch. And I provide the address. It's in the archive 0, which is my computer. The folder is called library, and the file I want you to look up is called launch function. So it at this run once path connects this file to this folder so that kOS now knows it needs to look here in order to find any functions that I might reference, so it'll know what all these are. Now, I'm not going to go through all of this in detail. The rest of these do keep using parameters and stuff like that because it does need all this information in order to do what it's going to do, but the way in which these functions operate is no different than what you have seen in the past. And again, I don't want to make this into a kOS tutorial video series. I don't want to distract too much from all of that, but at the same time, I want people that are new to programming and new to kOS to be able to do these kind of things. So I want to show you what's kind of possible if you are looking for a tutorial series. Once again, I can't recommend enough Bricomath's kOS Basics. Link down there in the description. In the meantime, the V2 No.4 was ready to be handed over to the engineers in Launch Complex 2, leaving us free to jump forward to Evelyn Wolf in the X3 rocket plane. Mission here is basically identical to the one Kenneth flew last episode, except this time we have the break the sound barrier contract. So we have to break the sound barrier and be above Mach 1 for 30 seconds, which this vessel can do trivially. Trivially. I mean, for this we got to get up to 620 meters per second, so that's not going to be a problem. By this I mean the Mach 2 science experiment, same one that Kenneth was doing last episode. Oh, we have broken the sound barrier. All we have to do is get our crew home safely. I wasn't even paying attention. Okay, we are approaching our altitude, at which point we'll level off. Start collecting science once we exceed 620 meters per second. And then it's just cruising at a constant speed until the fuel runs out. Oh, I know what I wanted to show you. I didn't like the way the flaps here, the spoiler, no, they are flaps. The flaps would interfere with the landing gear. So these flaps actually are still the same. This is now a structural piece just above the landing gear, so the flaps will no longer go into that. Again, that's an aesthetic choice, and that required shortening the ailerons, but honestly, how often does this thing need to really use them? Well, I guess Kenneth did, but it seemed to work fine anyway. And in that way, I don't get any of these control surfaces clipping into the landing gear, and I think that looks a little better. Okay, we're down to about half throttle, about a quarter of a tank of fuel left, and when that runs out, Evelyn will begin her glide down to the runway. You may recall last episode I launched too close to the Space Center, forcing Kenneth to make a U-turn in order to get to the runway. This time I started 300 kilometers away instead of 200, which looks like it's going to serve Evelyn very well. Now that I have the flaps deployed, you can see how they are no longer clipping into the landing gear. It's taking pleasure in the little things that are always important. Anyway, after coming to a stop on the runway, the recovery resulted in a rather belated news story. Oh, yes, we get it. Okay. Although we've done it many times before, we finally did the contract. So 1.8 science for Evelyn, same as, close that, crew updates, yep. And plane breaks the barrier of sound. Like, the newspapers are a little bit behind us on that one. With expert skills of Evelyn Wolf, X3 has traveled faster than sound. This experimental aircraft pushed through the immense turbulence of the transonic region to surpass this impressive milestone. With the rate of progress at this new space program, new milestones are sure to follow. Historical information. On October 14th, 1947, so 9 years earlier, well, whatever, we won't go there. U.S. Air Force pilot Chuck Yeager broke the sound barrier in the Bell X-1 that he nicknamed the Glamorous Glynis. The rocket-powered aircraft was dropped from a bomb bay of a B-29 and achieved a speed of Mach 1.06, that's 361 meters per second. The Soviets accomplished the feat in 1948 with the Lavochkin, we'll go with that, LA-176, and the British did it in 1948 with the de Havilland DH-108. Okay, cool. Alright, let's get into mission control and look for another contract. The supersonic flight tech node is still a few months away, so I'm really looking for another contract a rocket plane could do. I have this X-Planes high altitude, which requires you to reach an altitude of 40 kilometers. That's going to require the unlocking of a better cockpit, which only leaves the optional experimental rocket planes, which requires me to have a rocket plane reach a speed of 320 meters per second between an altitude of 10 and 12.5 kilometers, and then climb to an altitude of over 12,500 meters. That's definitely doable, even by my earlier X-Planes. For some reason, I didn't have an X1 in storage, so as soon as the X3 was recovered, preparations began for the air launch of the X2, and while that was happening, I figured the hiring of another 20 researchers were in order. If I were to start this over, hiring more researchers earlier is something I think I would have done differently. When launch day came, I unfortunately didn't realize it was night, but this really isn't a difficult contract, so we won't spend a lot of time with it anyway. Okay, so what do we got here? We got the speed part. We got to get up to 12. Okay, so we'll put this up to 13. There we go. So we got the speed part, obviously easy enough. Now we just got to get up to 12.5 meters, 12.5 kilometers. Boom, there we go. So now all we have to do is land or splash down anywhere, but I get an extra 11 reputation if I land on the runway with a descent angle of less than 10 degrees, which I'm thinking it's just a regular landing. They don't want you doing a parachute drop onto the runway, I guess is what they're saying. They want you to do a proper landing like. So we're going to do a proper landing like. Get down. Get down. Boink. Okay. Alright, and that should be that descent angle lower than 10 degrees business. Yep, there we go. So contract complete there. 150 confidence, 32 reputation, and an extra 11 and 48 confidence. Excellent. Okay, let's recover. I then went immediately into mission control and found that completing that contract spawned an upgraded version, now requiring a speed of 550 meters per second at an altitude of 20 kilometers, which is actually pretty much what the X3 was built for. And as that plane was already in the process of being mounted to the carrier, this contract represented some pretty low fruit. But before that plane could be mounted, supersonic flight got unlocked, which I'm hoping will help me with this required Mach 2 supersonic contract. This one requiring a jet aircraft to hold a speed between 625 and 650 meters per second for 5 minutes. So let's take a quick look at what this tech node unlocks for me. This actually opens up a lot of doors. the supersonic flight, because I got a whole stack of jet engines. I got an upgrade to the J35 engine. I've got an upgrade to my air launch system. I can now launch from an altitude of, what do we got here, 9.1 kilometers, and a higher launch speed as well. But I do have also an upgrade to the X1 cockpit. It's now the X2 cockpit, and that's going to be confusing because I've already got an X3 space plane, but whatever. And but its ceiling now is no longer 40 kilometers. It is, actually I think it was 30 kilometers, whatever, but its ceiling's been increased to 75 kilometers. That's great. I also have a whole army of shock intake cones, high speed intake cones, and a couple of new cockpits, the jet trainer cockpit and the DHC-3 Otter cockpit for doing supersonic jet. So this is all about, well, it's supersonic flight, isn't it? So I think that opens up a lot of doors. Unfortunately, I don't really know what I'm doing. So I started by doing what I did with my previous planes, looking through engines until I found something that seemed promising, and then searching for real-world planes that would have used that engine. When I found something that looked like it may perform and be fun, I used that as a basis for my build. I started with the Avon 107 turbojet and found the Saab 35 Draken, a Swedish fighter interceptor that first flew in October of 1955 and continued to be manufactured into the mid-70s. It's been a while since I last built a jet in this series. Those interested may want to check out that episode for more details on how to build planes in RP-1, as I'm not going to spend a lot of time on it here, mostly because, well, it didn't work. Don't get me wrong, it flew beautifully on its very first go, and I think looked pretty good doing it, but it didn't even come close to the necessary 625 meters per second. So I abandoned it to try a different engine, the J57P8, and this time I'm modeling my build on the Lockheed F-104 Starfighter, which first flew in February of 1954 and continued to be used right through the rest of the 20th century. This engine is equipped with an afterburner, which I was initially puzzled as to how to use. In the stock game, you have the J404 Panther engine that has a button for turning on the afterburner, but it seems with this engine the afterburner comes on automatically. Here you can see that the core throttle and afterburner throttle are both at 100%. That, in conjunction with the bright orange flame coming out the rear, leads me to believe that the afterburner is now on. In fact, if I cut back to takeoff, you can see how the core throttle quickly climbs to 100%, after which the afterburner throttle does the same. Either way, the plane maxed out at a speed just shy of 490 meters per second. Still not enough. Perhaps I could squeeze more out of it by keeping the afterburner from coming on until I've maxed out my speed with just the core throttle. Maybe I should be at a different altitude, maybe I need a redesign, or wait until I can upgrade this engine. But by this point, I had been at this for a few hours with the deadline for this video approaching, so I decided to put this aside in favor of another rocket plane. This time with the upgraded X2 cockpit to do the high altitude contract, which requires you to reach a crude altitude of 40 kilometers. I abandoned the optional experimental Rocketplanes contract so I could pick this up. This was actually a mistake, as once I complete the high altitude contract, this experimental Rocketplanes contract will no longer be available. My excuse is that this is happening a real-world week after I had put aside the Starfighter build, and I'd forgotten the X3 was currently being mounted with the intent of completing the experimental Rocketplanes contract. Oops. Anyway, the building and testing of the X4 went well, but I'm going to leave the details for its planned inaugural flight next episode. I did hire 10 more engineers to bring the staff in the hangar to 20, speeding up the build, and I then decided to take another crack at achieving the 5,000 kilometer downrange milestone, and I'm happy to say that I finally succeeded in a build that achieved the necessary distance, the details of which I'm also going to have to put off until next episode, as I really want to see how my reorganized kOS functions perform during the launch of V2 No.4. But in the meantime, the X3 was, once again, ready for air launch. Given that this mission is not much different from the X3 you saw earlier, I'm not going to be spending much time with it. One thing of note is that this is my first use of my upgraded air launch capability, allowing this plane to start higher and faster than its predecessors. I'll also point out, once again, that I could have been satisfying that experimental Rocketplanes contract right now. In fact, I wouldn't have even had to adjust this mission's profile. Now, the X4 that you briefly saw in simulation has only just begun being built. I'm thinking now that it may be best to cycle through another X3 or two before that high-altitude version has its inaugural launch, but that's going to have to be for another episode. Right now, after collecting its requisite batch of Mach 2 science, Evelyn was all set to bring her home, though seemingly at a bit of a higher speed than normal. Coming in pretty hot. There we are. No problems. Okay. Down, 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 down. Boop. Boop. Oh, I was time... Oh my god, that's why that was so scary. I was time warping through all that. Alright. No harm done. But there's no time to relax, because just a day later, the V2 and its reorganized software was all set on the pad. Honestly, all I've got to do is run our program here. So V2 number 4 with 315 and 30,000. Boom and boom. And yeah, let's go. No big JED this time. This is purely going to be kOS. And we are off. We are off. We are off. And we are starting to pitch over just a little bit at a heading of 315 degrees. That's what the 315 was. And the 30,000, we should be at a pitch of about 45 degrees when we get to an altitude of 30,000 meters. Otherwise, we're just letting kOS do all our work for us. Okay, and you can see how the 30,000, we're just 30,000. We're not quite at a pitch of 45 degrees. You know, it's dealing with what it's dealing with. It does the best it can. And, oh, there we go, yeah. Planetary photography has just kicked on. We are doing it over the forest. We should be over forest over all of this as we head over northwards along the Florida Peninsula. And that's it. We are done locking to prograde. It will do the best it can in this very thin atmosphere. 140, there we go. And that's a new batch of planetary photography. Again, low space over the forest. And there is our contract complete. The contract does not require us to recover anything, but we do have to recover the planetary photography. There's film in there that we got to get, so we will be recovering that. But that is not going to happen until we get back down to 80 kilometers. That's again going to be handled by kOS. Just ditched our payload. Looks like we're not going to hit this city. We're going to be going north, or going north of it. I might play with the idea of using range safety to blow up that booster after separation. Either way, the recovery went nominally, with our little payload netting us another 3.8 science, most of that in near space above the forest. Just might be worth my while to launch another one of these sometime, but before that happens, I'm going to have to finally make that attempt at the 5,000 kilometer downrange milestone. But you know that's going to have to be for the next episode, so I'm going to thank you for watching and hope to see you again next time.